Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going to be discussing or reviewing two different books. So recently I read Foundryside and The Bear and the Nightingale, almost back to back, and I feel like on the surface these two books have a lot of similarities, but I think they potentially have very different readers. So I thought it would be fun to review and compare and contrast these two books. So that is what we're going to do today. You're getting two books for the price of one. And both of these are going to be spoiler-free reviews, so feel free to stick around if you've read one but not the other. Either way, you're good to go. So Foundryside by Robert Jackson Bennett is an adult fantasy novel, and it is the first book in a trilogy. The rough summary of this book is that it follows a young woman named Sanchia, who is a young thief, and she has the ability to understand objects which helps her thieving. She doesn't really know where this power came from. She doesn't really know how it works, but she's able to touch an object and feel it and understand it and kind of work with it. She lives in a Florence-inspired fantasy world, so think Renaissance time where there were merchant houses that were running the city of Florence. It's very similar to that. And with that setting, there is a big focus on the government not really being involved and the mercantile houses kind of having rules of their own. And because of that, there is a big class divide between the poor and the elite. And in this fantasy world, there is this magic called scribing, which is basically a way to manipulate objects and their properties. Sanchia's next thieving job is to steal an important magical scribed item, but this job has her stumbling into a much bigger plot, which is way out of her scope as a thief. The Bear and the Nightingale by Catherine Arden is an adult fantasy novel, and it is the first book in a trilogy. Wow, sounds very familiar. The rough summary of this book is that it follows a young woman named Vasia, or Vasilisa, and it follows her from when she's a child to when she's a young adult. She is the daughter of a minor lord who lives deep in the Russian wilderness, where mythology and stories have not quite faded away. And when Vasia's father brings home a stepmother for Vasia, Vasia is suddenly forbidden from honoring the household spirits. The winters become harder, the crops begin to fail, and punishments become very strict for Vasia. And Vasia's free-spirited nature, which defies both her stepmother and society's expectations, sends her on a journey to save both the mists she loves and her people. So let's start with the comparison of these two books. Both are the first book in a trilogy, both are adult fantasies, both are published by Del Rey originally, which I find very interesting, and both were originally acquired and published by an American press. Both authors are American, and both are about young women coming into their own powers. Both use multiple perspectives to give depth and sympathy to the characters. Both are in third person. Both books have an importance on setting and atmosphere. Both have a harsh world where readers see fantasy violence and oppression. Both stories have an importance on myth and legend. And I would say both of these books have very strong ending with high stakes, and both characters face consequences for what they do in the story. And both of these books tie up the original conflict that's introduced, while leaving the story able to expand into the next books in the series. A lot of times the first book will just set up what's going to be happening throughout the rest of the series, or you will face a villain which will be the reoccurring villain for the rest of the series. But both of these books have a original antagonist conflict villain, which are pretty much faced and defeated, leaving the world to be expanded into something different in the next two books. And the most important thing about these books is that the author has a very clear vision for what they want the story tone to be, which is what I think makes both of these books very good. Both of these authors knew what they wanted to write in their stories. They had a very clear vision and they did it really precisely, which makes these books feel both unique and really grounded, and I ended up giving both of these books 4 stars. So let's talk about contrast. What makes these two books very different, because they seem really similar. Going back to atmosphere and setting being a very important part, especially the violence and harshness of both worlds. While I would say both books have an equal amount of gore, violence, and oppression, I would say the focus in Foundryside is on slavery, threats of sexual assault, and class divides play a really big part of it. But what makes the harshness of Foundryside different is that it plays into character motivations and how you understand them, whereas the harsh world in The Bear and the Nightingale, again, there is a big focus on the misogynistic world, the threat of sexual assault. But what makes the key difference between the harshness in this world and Foundryside is that instead of just playing into character motivations and understandings, the kind of harshness that you see in The Bear and the Nightingale really plays into the themes of the story and what the author is trying to say. Foundryside isn't not saying those things are bad. The violence in here is definitely definitely not supposed to be emulated or anything. But I think there is a big difference in thematic purpose. I would say this is much more of a fantasy adventure novel, and themes are probably lesser on the totem pole of importance to the author in writing these books, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale is making a little bit more commentary on things, and the themes play a little bit more into what happens in the story and the characters. Going into some other differences, Foundryside takes place over a short period of time, so it's very fast-paced, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale takes place over many years, so it is a much slower-paced story. Both of these books have action and plot that takes place, but Foundryside is much more like, again, that adventure fantasy story, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale are much more thematic about showing the characters' growth. It's just a very different feel. Foundryside is much more of a motley crew kind of vibe, and you kind of feel like every character has their own baggage, which lead to their character motivations, but there is definitely a focus on our main protagonist, which is arguably Gregor and Sanchia, and I would say the internal conflicts of both of those characters are much more important, and the relationships and character dynamics kind of play second fiddle to the internal character struggles, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale focuses on characters making mistakes, being imperfect, or morally ambiguous, which does feed into character motivations and internal conflict, but more importantly, thematic purpose in the story. This story is much more about showing a young girl growing up, growing into her own. And while Foundryside works to make its main characters sympathetic and understandable, The Bear and the Nightingale really works to make the villains sympathetic, or at least understandable, or at least morally ambiguous. I would say The Bear and the Nightingale is much more about the characters' interpersonal dynamics and power plays. And again, while you're getting the internal conflict of Vasya, Foundryside is only about internal conflict. It's not really working to make the villains sympathetic. It's not really working to give a great interplay dynamic between the villains and the heroes. And if that was confusing, I will go over it again at the end a little bit, so don't worry. So for what I've said already, I think you can kind of tell Foundryside is a focus on action of the story, it's plot above all else. And the kind of second problem is the internal conflicts of the two main characters. There is a hint of romance in this book, but only a hint, but it is a sapphic romance, which is nice. I would say that romance plays a much bigger part in The Bear and the Nightingale, but I want to stress that, again, not very much romance happens in this book as well. It is a very slow building romance in this series. While the romance is more of a tool to kind of flesh out the characters in this book, The Bear and the Nightingale, because it deals so much with the interplay between characters and dynamics between characters, there is a really big focus on characters' connection and their power play, and it happens with the romance as well. Even if there isn't really that much romance, it's much more about the connection between the characters. So while both The Bear and the Nightingale and Foundryside don't really have a lot of romance, I think the intention of not having that much romance is very different in the books. Foundryside doesn't have a lot of romance because it's not really the focus, and The Bear and the Nightingale is more stressing the connection between characters and their dynamics instead of stressing like the romantic scenes, if that makes sense. The Bear and the Nightingale is much more focused on setting up Vasya as a main character, and it's focused on setting up the atmosphere around the story. So we got an action book and we have an atmosphere and character-driven book. I would say arguably both books are character-driven stories, like the characters are the ones moving the plots forward in both books, but Foundryside again is action-focused, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale is atmosphere-focused, so much more heavily relies on characters and their interpersonal dynamics. Getting into the writing, Foundryside has a very clear and concise style of writing to make explanations understandable. There's a lot of big plot points, a lot of complicated magic systems. So Foundryside takes the more clear and concise approach to writing, while The Bear and the Nightingale is much more reliant on descriptions and lyrical writing to create that atmosphere that I was talking about. Another contrasting point is that The Bear and the Nightingale is not afraid to do its own thing plot-wise. I would say there's not anything super surprising in the book, but it's going at its own pace and things happen in a different order than I was expecting, and things take a lot longer or a lot quicker, seemingly at willy-nilly, and that's kind of of where its uniqueness shines through is what the author decides to focus on, whereas Foundryside follows more typical story beats for a fantasy adventure novel, but its own uniqueness shines through the characters and the world that is created. So even though Foundryside is more typical, it doesn't feel like it's not its own story separate from other fantasy books. It very much feels like its own thing. And going into magic systems, Foundryside has a very hard magic system, a lot of rules in place. It feels very grounded into the world and like physics, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale is much more connected to the idea of mythology and lore, so its magic is a lot more whimsical and looser. Foundryside is object-based magic, and like the idea of powers, whereas The Bear and the Nightingale, because it focuses on lore, is a lot more based on creatures, if that makes sense. And to go into the endings of both books, Foundryside ends with one problem solved, but this one problem being solved creates a bunch more questions and a bigger issue that they have to handle in the next coming book. And The Bear and the Nightingale ends similarly with one problem solved, but it has this feeling of a whole world to explore. It really feels like Vasya is set free to go on her own adventure, and I would say Foundryside feels like it's going to stay in the setting it's in, whereas Bear and the Nightingale feels like it's going to expand into new territories, into new places. So that's kind of the similarities and differences between the books. So let's get into why I didn't give either of these books 5 stars. I would say The Bear and the Nightingale was closer to 5 stars, but for me it just needed a little bit more fleshing out towards the end conflict. What I really loved about this book is the multiple perspectives and kind of like the sympathy that we get to give to all the characters, because we really see the internal conflicts with them and the interpersonal conflicts between all the characters. And at the end, you're kind of seeing all the myths weave together, you're seeing all these paths lead together, all of these character conflicts finally crashing into each other, all these characters finally coming into direct conflict with each other. And so I just wish we had a little bit more time to like set up that final conflict, and the final conflict itself could have been a little bit longer. And I think it just would have made the book that much stronger just to get a little bit more these characters that you've seen kind of twisting around each other, dancing around each other to finally like crash into each other. And I gave Foundryside 4 out of 5 stars because I thought it needed a little bit more time spent on character interactions and dynamics, and I wish the side characters were just a little bit more built up. I thought that Sanchia and Gregor were really strong in this book, and I thought the relationship between Sanchia and Cleft was really well done, but I just needed a little bit more of the characters and their motley crew kind of coming together. I needed a little bit more of not just the internal conflict, but the interplay between the characters. But overall, these were both excellent books. I gave them 4 stars because I really liked them. Both of these have potential to end up on my favorites of the year, but why compare and contrast these 2 books? The reason why I wanted to compare and contrast these 2 similar but not so similar novels is because I think there's several ways to make a good story, a well-rounded story. And for me, it really doesn't matter what the author decides to focus on. If they want to focus on plot, if they want to focus on characters, it really doesn't matter to me. Yes, I have a preference. I definitely have a preference towards character-driven stories, but I don't necessarily think plot-driven novels are like bad. What really matters to me is the writing being really good, the storytelling, the craft being really well done. It doesn't really matter to me what the author focuses on, as long as those elements come together. And I think both of these novels are good examples for that. The Bear and the Nightingale is focused on atmosphere and character dynamics, and you can tell that the craft is there to support it. And Foundryside is supposed to be a fun action-adventure story with a unique setting and extreme internal conflicts, and the author does that. And you can really see that in the differences of these novels. The Bear and the Nightingale, it's slow-paced, it takes place over many years. We get multiple perspectives. It has very lyrical writing that all plays into the atmosphere, into the characters, into the dynamics. Whereas Foundryside, it has concise writing to explain the world more effectively. We are given a really short time period. It really amps up the pressure of the novel, of the tension, of the plot. And both of the choices that the author made make for good stories. So going back to comparing and contrasting these 2 novels, The Bear and the Nightingale is all about the internal conflicts. It's about Vasya growing up, and it's about the 2 antagonists of the story being built up alongside her. It's about seeing all those character motivations and those internal conflicts. And while there are external conflicts, the biggest external conflict is the interpersonal character conflicts. It's about the different characters clashing with one another. So the most important thing to the author, the thing that was the focus, is the main character and the character dynamics. Under that, we have atmospheres and the setting of the world. That was probably the second most important thing. And then after that is themes, and then after comes plot. For Foundryside, to me, this feels like a external conflict book with some internal character conflicts. So the big thing about this novel is the plot, the action, but you have some internal conflict to make the story more fleshed out, to make the characters more sympathetic and understandable, and to make them feel more real as people. So Foundryside, the most important thing, it's that plot, it's that action. Second, I would say, is the atmosphere, the setting of the world, the magic. That unique setting, that unique magic system is what draws you in and makes you interested in learning more. Then next comes the main character and their internal struggles. After that comes the character dynamics, the interpersonal character relationships, and then after that is themes. And I think that's what makes these two novels so different. While they are both adult fantasy novels, while they both have unique settings, while they both have main characters that are young women, just the different focuses of the author and kind of what became the major focus, what became the minor focuses, what really wasn't the focus. Those are the things, the focus on different elements of craft, that's what makes the novels different from each other. Now let's get into readers. What kind of readers are going to read these books? Obviously, one reader, one person could like both of these books as I have. I would say I really loved both of these books. It's really hard to compare and contrast them because it's apples and oranges. But I would say personal preference-wise, I lean a little bit more towards The Bear and the Nightingale just because, again, it is very, very focused on internal conflicts of the characters and character power dynamics. That's where I like to stay. That's my favorite thing. But Foundryside is just as good. It's not lacking in characters at all. It's just a little bit more focused on plot. But The Bear and the Nightingale, I think The Bear and the Nightingale is for readers who love atmosphere, who love a whimsical fantasy book, where there's not a lot of rules to the fantasy. They like character growth, they like character dynamics, and they like those things to be at the forefront of the story. They like stories where there is a harsh world, but it is purposely made. So violence against women, etc., it plays into the story, it plays into what the author is trying to say. And of course, the biggest thing is they like a slow-paced story, they like a slow build-up. So I would say The Bear and the Nightingale is perfect for fans of Naomi Novik, for Kristen Cashore, for Madeline Miller and Marie Rutowski. I think all four of those authors really focus on character dynamics. They focus on a woman coming into their own power, and there is a focus on atmosphere, lyrical writing, a focus on setting, but characters always come first. Uprooted and Spitting Silver particularly, I feel like have a very similar feel, especially because both are inspired by Eastern European settings. And to give a comparison of a book I did not like, I would say The Bear and the Nightingale also reminds me a lot of Strange the Dreamer and Laini Taylor's writing style, and kind of where she puts focus on. But I wanted to give an example of a book I didn't like, just to show like sometimes even all the things that I like don't necessarily make a good book for me. But I do think that fans of Laini Taylor could possibly also like this book. And getting into Foundryside. A Foundryside reader is someone who likes a fast-paced fantasy novel with a unique setting and magical world. It's for readers who like plot, but who also need charming characters to connect them to the world. Again, it's for people that like plot, but they need characters to flesh out, back up the story and why they connect to the story. It's for someone who not just needs a magic system, but who needs magical rules that are supposed to be understood and broken throughout the story. And it's for someone who likes a dark world and themes of violence, but they don't necessarily want the book to feel hopeless or truly grim dark. While the harsh world is not necessarily used for themes in Foundryside novels, like this isn't for like a grim dark fan. This isn't like a Game of Thrones kind of read. These novels don't feel like truly hopeless. And I would definitely recommend Foundryside for fans of Brandon Sanderson. Mistborn especially, definitely some similarities there. Black Sun by Rebecca Roanhorse comes to mind as well. Even like Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, the anime or the manga. And a book I didn't like but would like to compare is the Shades of Magic series. A Darker Shade of Magic, again, has a focus on plot and conflict, magical atmosphere, magical world, magical setting, and then like the characters' internal conflict. Again, Shade of Magic, it didn't work for me, I didn't love it, but I could see why a fan of that series would also enjoy Foundryside. But yes, that is my compare and contrast of Foundryside and The Bear and the Nightingale. I hope these reviews helped you to find a new book. If you read both of these books, I would love to know which book you were more of a fan of. I'm personally going to continue both of these series. Actually, I've already completed this entire series, whereas I'm currently reading the second book in this series. But I would love to know more about what you think about these two books, or which one you feel more compelled to read. I think both of these authors, again, had a really concise idea for what they wanted their stories to be, and it really feels like that. Both of these feel fleshed out. They feel really, really well done. And while these books may end up being very different, I think that these books do have the potential to be loved by one reader. But thank you so much for watching. I hope this review was helpful. Again, let me know, are you gonna read either of these books? Are you gonna read one rather than the other? If you've read both, how did you feel about that? But thank you so much for watching. I'll see you guys later, and happy reading.